Hello, everyone. My name is Sid Melcher. I'm Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of Western Massachusetts, and I am stepping into Steve Spellman's job today in introducing our speaker. And I'm reading off my phone, so I apologize for that. But I'm delighted to have you all here for our first instant issues of 2025. I would like to thank our sponsors, Wilbraham and Munson Academy and Sir Speedy. And as always, we are grateful to NAI Plotkin, which provides us with office space as well as this terrific meeting space. I'd also like to thank Jeremy Cole and Jeff Krasner, who are recording today's event for us. Our speaker today is Dr. Sara Newland, Assistant Professor of Government at Smith College. And I think this is the third time she's spoken to us. I think you spoke on Hong Kong in person just before the doors slammed shut. And then you spoke to us as part of the China town hall online during the pandemic. She is a scholar of local politics in China and Taiwan and seeks to understand the behavior of local officials as domestic public servants and as actors in international relations. Her research on local governance and public service provision has been published in China Quarterly and Governance. Her new work focuses on subnational diplomacy, and in particular on the role that state and local officials play in the complicated relationships between the U.S., China, and Taiwan. Her work on U.S. Taiwan subnational engagement has been published in Pacific Review, and she is currently working on a book project on the U.S. China subnational diplomacy in an era of rising great power competition. Today, she will be speaking to us on democracy in the shadow of great power competition, the politics of Taiwan. Please join me in welcoming Sara Newland.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out today to listen to this. So I have a little bit of I realized I sent Sid a slightly different title maybe than I have up on my slides, but it was a long time ago. Often the question that I get asked when I talk about Taiwan is whether a Chinese invasion of Taiwan is imminent or whether a war is inevitable. And so I will talk about that a little bit today, but I think one of the things that often gets lost in conversations about the prospects of a war in the Taiwan Strait or a conflict between the US and China is the fact that Taiwan is its own place and people in Taiwan have their own perspective on this. And often, I think media depictions and sort of discussions of this issue really focus on great power competition between the US and China and don't really pay sufficient attention to the perspectives of people in Taiwan on this question. So I want to focus for the first part of my talk on the kind of question of whether Taiwan is Chinese or in what senses we might or might not consider Taiwan Chinese. And what the U.S. Chinese and Taiwanese views on this question are, because I think that can help us to understand why the status of Taiwan is such an intractable problem in the relationship between these three places. And then sort of relatedly, I'll talk a bit at the end about why tensions in the Taiwan Strait have increased so dramatically since 2016, and that's kind of the case whether you look at things like military PLA military drills around Taiwan, sort of practice blockades, PLA flights into airspace around Taiwan, rhetoric about Taiwan, attempts to isolate Taiwan in the international system. All of these things have really been sort of rising fairly dramatically, I think, since 2016. And so I want to end by talking a bit about why. Okay, so is Taiwan Chinese? I want to start with the PRC, the Chinese government view. And I will say, this is something that these are claims that Chinese government officials and documents make over and over again about how Taiwan sort of always has been part of Chinese territory. Public opinion polling in China is very difficult. In the past 10 years or so, many of the most reputable public opinion firms have been shut down. And also, I think people don't feel fully free to speak on an issue that's perceived as a kind of core issue of national security. And so it's a little hard to know exactly what, what percent of the Chinese population believes what on this issue. But I do think that this is something that people grow up really believing the sort of party line on, that Taiwan is a core part of China and that it's sort of Chinese territory that has been unfairly wrested from the PRC. And so I think it's sort of reasonable to believe that probably most Chinese citizens also agree with the view that I'm going to present here as the sort of PRC government view. So the Chinese government, often will say things like Taiwan has always been a part of Chinese territory since the beginning of time. It's been a part of China, and this is a claim that I think there are some elements of truth and some elements of falsehood too. So over the Chinese dynastic period, I actually show in my Chinese politics class, I show this sort of dynamic map of how the territory that was considered Chinese changed from one dynasty to another. And the borders of what was considered China shrank dramatically at some points and grew very expansively at others. During most Chinese imperial history, Taiwan was considered outside of Chinese territory. And there's a wonderful book that draws on sort of archival data, letters to and from the emperor saying things like, oh, that's just a ball of mud. That's not part of China. That's, outside the sea. We wouldn't possibly want that. And so it really is only in the final dynasty in imperial China that Taiwan becomes incorporated politically into the sort of dynastic, the imperial administrative structure. So during parts of the Qing dynasty, and obviously I'm simplifying here because we don't have 3 weeks for this, but during a couple hundred years of the Qing dynasty, the western part of Taiwan, so the part that's in black and white on this map, was ruled by Qing bureaucrats. One thing to note, though, is that this green half of the island was really never incorporated into the Chinese imperial structure. This is where the indigenous population on Taiwan is clustered, and this part was really never incorporated within the kind of bureaucratic and political structure of the Qing state. For Chinese officials, they really see Taiwan as kind of unfinished business in a variety of ways. So they argue, first of all, that if it hadn't been for what's referred to often as the century of humiliation, when China was essentially carved up by imperial powers, both Japanese and Western imperial powers, that Taiwan would have been sort of solidly incorporated into the Chinese state today. And so, for instance, in this period of Qing dynasty rule over at least the western half of Taiwan ended with Taiwan being given over to Japan as a result of China's loss in the Sino-Japanese War. And so their sense is, this was a symbol. Taiwan becoming a Japanese colony was a symbol of China's sort of humiliation. And as China becomes a rising power in the world, I think it's deeply important to Taiwan or to Chinese leaders to sort of show that they have, cast off, put aside the legacies of that period when China was very weak. And so the return of Hong Kong to mainland China in 1997, I think, was one piece of that, right, of sort of removing this last vestige of British colonialism. And from the perspective of Chinese leaders, they sort of see Taiwan in a similar way, that they think Taiwan should be incorporated as something like a province of China, and that'll be the kind of end of this legacy of the century of humiliation. I think another piece of the sort of PRC view that China is, or that Taiwan is Chinese, relates to what Chinese leaders see as the sort of unfinished legacy of the Chinese Civil War. So in the first half of the 20th century, so beginning uh, after the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911, there was, for decades, this sort of competition for control of China between one government or one political party, the KMT, claiming to rule China as the Republic of China, and another party, the Chinese Communist Party, who wanted to rule it as the People's Republic of China, right? So you had these two contesting visions of China as a country. And ultimately, the Civil War, still never formally resolved, was de facto finished when the KMT fled to Taiwan in 1949. In order to sort of avoid being completely wiped out by the Communist Party. Mao Zedong at that point declared the founding of the People's Republic of China, and the government that we and nearly all of the world regards as the government of China today is that the People's Republic of China led by the Chinese Communist Party. So from the perspective of the Chinese government, they sort of see, they say like this question has been resolved, right? Any territories that were held by the Republic of China government should now be regarded as part of China under control of the PRC because we won the Civil War, right? We are the government of China at this point. A final way that Chinese leaders, and I think many people in China also, a final sort of type of logic that they use for arguing that Taiwan is Chinese is a kind of ethnocultural logic, where, if you go to Taiwan, the population there nearly universally speaks Mandarin. Many people speak a second language as well, like a Taiwanese language. But people speak Mandarin. If you went there at this time of year, around Lunar New Year, people have the same kinds of red lanterns and, doorway hangings with sort of traditional Lunar New Year phrases. And, there's lots of ways in which culturally there are a lot of similarities between Chinese culture as practiced in mainland China or in Hong Kong and Chinese culture in Taiwan. They're both Confucian societies. They both draw on the same, literary traditions, historical traditions. And so if you think about Chineseness as being defined in a kind of linguistic or cultural way, there certainly are some arguments for seeing Taiwan as a Chinese society. And so this is something that, I think you see reflected often in Chinese leaders' speeches where they talk about sort of like our brethren or our compatriots on Taiwan, right, with this sense that everyone is sort of part of a common cultural group. So, I think it's understandable that, this sort of set of arguments, I think, supports the idea that, well, of course, Taiwan, is a part of China and, should be sort of politically incorporated into the People's Republic of China if China today is, if that's how we define China today, right, is as the PRC governed by Chinese Communist Party rule. These sets of arguments wind up being used to support the idea that it's sort of natural or inevitable or right that Taiwan would be part of that political entity of China. This, I think, is quite different from how people on Taiwan tend to view Taiwan's sort of relationship with Chineseness. And Taiwan, in contrast to China, is a vibrant democracy with full sort of freedom of expression, freedom of press. And so we actually do have quite good public opinion data, for instance, on what people in Taiwan believe. And, there are real disagreements over some of these questions of identity and history and how they should be interpreted within Taiwan. But so for many people, I think they really emphasize something I mentioned a minute ago, which is that Chinese imperial rule in Taiwan was very partial and very short-lived as a sort of proportion of the length of Chinese imperial history. People also talk about the fact that the People's Republic of China has never ruled the island of Taiwan, right? So although the PRC has been the entity we define as China since 1949, the Chinese Communist Party and the PRC have never controlled this island of Taiwan, and have no legitimate claim in international law to do so, right? So there's nothing that specifically says this territory of Taiwan does or does not belong to the PRC. Chinese government officials make the claim that it does, but it's not correct that that's embedded in things like any sort of formal statement of international law. Historically, I think instead of emphasizing the kind of Chinese history of self-determination, people in Taiwan often look to the fact or emphasize the fact that Taiwanese people have never really been given the opportunity to define for themselves the political entity of Taiwan. So, Taiwan, this island, was sort of handed over to the Japanese to rule as a colony by the Qing rulers in 1895. In 1945, when Japan gave up its colonial sort of acquisitions, territories, it was kind of handed over to the Republic of China, led by Chiang Kai-shek, to govern. It wasn't formally made into Chinese territory at that point, but essentially the British and the Americans said, like, we don't want to govern this. We are going to just sort of hand it over for safekeeping to the ROC to govern. There were some attempts and some conversations at that point, including among American policymakers, over, maybe Taiwan should be made into its own country at this point, right? If we're in a moment of sort of decolonization, perhaps this is a place that should have its own status. But ultimately, that was not a view that really gained any traction. And so Taiwan, rather than becoming its own country at that point, which would have been a fairly logical point for it to have done so, became this sort of territory that was occupied by the Kuomintang, the KMT, leading this Republic of China as it sort of fled at the end of the Chinese Civil War. This cultural position, I think, is very interesting, this question of whether Taiwan is Chinese. And this is something that is really contested within Taiwanese society. And there are some interesting kind of political and generational elements to this. So there are some people in Taiwan, and I would say especially people who are older people and whose families fled with the nationalists from China in 1949 at the end of the Civil War. That group of people, I think, tends to essentially agree with the Chinese position that Taiwan is a Chinese society. These are people, especially older people with roots in the mainland, some of them actually born in the mainland, would often describe themselves as being Chinese. And they tend to really emphasize the sort of shared cultural legacies, writers, artists, particular texts that are sort of core to a kind of cultural heritage that is also shared among many people in Taiwan. However, that view, I think, is really shifting over time, and more people in Taiwan consider themselves to be Taiwanese rather than Chinese, and consider those to be really different identities, right? With some shared elements, just as like Americans and Canadians have some common elements of our culture, but we wouldn't say they're the same thing. I think people in Taiwan really increasingly emphasize the fact that Taiwanese identity is not the same as Chinese identity. And you can see this reflected really clearly in some interesting public opinion polling that's been done since the early 1990s. So really the whole time that Taiwan has been a democracy, they've been asking these same poll questions. And so this question is a really simple question. It's just, do you consider yourself Taiwanese, and Chinese? And then there's a non-response category. And when they started asking this question in 1992, only 17.6% of people considered themselves Taiwanese. And a majority considered themselves either just Chinese or Taiwanese and Chinese. And what's happened over time is this dramatic growth of this green line, the people who consider themselves only Taiwanese, and a dramatic decline in the people who consider themselves just Chinese, which is this blue line. So today, about 2/3 of people in Taiwan consider themselves only Taiwanese. And the number of people who consider themselves only Chinese is down to about 2%. And so this has been, I think, a really striking change, and one that Chinese government officials worry about quite a lot for reasons I'll talk about in a little while. But I think especially, there has been in the era of democratization a kind of rediscovery of and renewed interest in Taiwan's history and the ways in which Taiwan's history is actually quite distinct from China's history. Taiwan is a kind of melting pot society. It has an indigenous population, but it also underwent multiple different waves of colonization by the Dutch, the Spanish, and the Japanese. This has brought a variety of cultural influences, architectural influences, culinary, linguistic, et cetera, to Taiwan that never came to mainland China. Taiwan also is the home to kind of multiple waves of immigration from China, beginning really in the 1600s. So a lot of the people in Taiwan, they are sort of ethnically Chinese, but they didn't come in 1949. Their families have been there since the 1600s. And it was actually a fairly small minority of the population that fled to Taiwan in 1949 at the end of the Chinese Civil War. So I think sometimes there is a kind of incorrect depiction of Taiwan as almost like an empty place until the end of the Chinese Civil War, and then all of a sudden the nationalists arrived. And in fact, there was this vibrant multi-ethnic society that was there before. And so for someone who's maybe, a young person in Taiwan today, they in many cases have never been to China. They said, my family came from China 400 years ago. China is no more similar to me than like the UK is to a 19-year-old growing up in America who says, okay, yeah, my family came over in the 1700s, but I'm certainly not British. Another point that I think has really come to be emphasized in the last 15 or so years in Taiwan is the fact that the ways in which Taiwan is Chinese were in some ways the product of very brutal kind of culturally assimilationist policies enforced by the KMT during the long period of martial law. So after the KMT arrived on Taiwan in 1949, they ruled under a pretty brutal dictatorship until the 1980s when Taiwan began to democratize. And during that period, people were punished for speaking Taiwanese. So kids, for instance, if they spoke Taiwanese rather than Mandarin in schools, their teachers would hit them. If you couldn't speak fluent Mandarin, you were ineligible for most of the government jobs, which were the sort of best jobs on the island. There was sort of systematic discrimination where most of the best jobs were reserved for people who had fled mainland China in 1949, and the local population was really shut out of a lot of forms of employment. And students were taught a very narrow version, like the history that they were taught in school was Chinese history. They were not taught anything about Taiwan's history as its own place. And so I think for a lot of people, the process of democratization and the process of sort of embracing Taiwan's its own history and its own linguistic traditions have really gone hand in hand. So now, for instance, in schools, Mandarin is still used as the dominant language, but students also learn Taiwanese, Hokkien, Minnan, other like local languages in schools. And so I think there's this sense that, if it weren't for this period of really brutal one-party rule, Taiwan would actually be culturally much less Chinese than it is today. And then finally, I think people in Taiwan are really proud of Taiwan's transition to democracy, which was a transition for which people fought extremely hard. A lot of people were treated pretty brutally for their participation in Taiwan's democracy movement and their attempts to fight back against this very brutal regime. And so for a lot of people, they say, you know, this is the difference between mainland China and Taiwan. Like, it's not just a question of sort of checking a box of like, are you a democracy? Are you an autocracy? But democratic practices have become a kind of part of the DNA of Taiwan in a way that is very different. It's just become not just a political difference, but also a kind of cultural difference. Participation rates in elections are quite high. Protest participation, often there are these like massive protests in Taiwan when, you know, people are mad about something that the government is doing. And so I think there's this sense that those are ways in which over the course of the last several decades, Taiwan has just evolved to be a very different place than China. So the last piece that I think is important to consider is the view from U.S. policy, because the U.S. has maintained a really sort of strong military presence in the South China Sea and in the Taiwan Strait since the 1950s, so really since the Korean War. And the U.S.'s policy, it's like the wording of it often is really difficult for people to get their heads around, and I think not worth spending too much time on. But I think the key sort of things to keep in mind are that the U.S., like virtually every country in the world, has a one China policy. The way the U.S.'s policy is defined, which is not the same as lots of other countries, is that there is one official government of China. The China is the People's Republic of China, governed by the Chinese Communist Party. The U.S. does not recognize Taiwan as part of that China. It says that the status of Taiwan is undetermined. So whether it is a part of China or not has to be determined via peaceful means and with the consent of the people of Taiwan. And so the U.S. has really strong unofficial ties to the Taiwanese government, but it doesn't formally recognize Taiwan as a country. So I think that this kind of background on these different positions on Taiwan and its Chineseness can help us understand a little bit of why tensions in the Taiwan Strait have increased dramatically over the past now little less than a decade. And as I mentioned at the outset, you know, almost any metric you use of rising tensions, like it's clear that this is happening. So a dramatic increase in kind of practice blockades by the Chinese military, dramatic rise of you know, incursions into Taiwan's the airspace around Taiwan, the ADIZ by PLA aircraft, increasing attempts to get other countries to de-recognize Taiwan. So the number of countries that have like a formal diplomatic relationship with Taiwan has declined fairly dramatically in the last 8 years as China has sort of picked off Taiwan's remaining diplomatic allies. Lots of ways in which, you know, people are sort of watching this as a potential flashpoint and wondering whether some of these actions are a kind of precursor to an invasion of Taiwan by the PRC. And so I think there are like a few different reasons why we see this happening. So one is that we are now, so in 2024, there was a presidential election in Taiwan. The Democratic Progressive Party won the presidency for the third term in a row. The DPP is the party that has traditionally been much more skeptical of China. It is not, I think it's sometimes incorrectly referred to as a pro-independence party. It no longer, I think officials in the party recognize that a formal declaration of independence would probably lead China to invade. And so they no longer really advocate for that. But there certainly are a lot of people within the party who are very supportive of the idea of Taiwan independence. And more broadly, I think it's a party that has embraced the idea that Taiwan has its own identity, that it is not a Chinese place, and they're kind of skeptical of any form of unification with China. So, you know, I think the fact that the DPP has won now 3 presidential elections in a row is in some ways a product of this graph that I showed you before, where there just are more and more people who really think of themselves as Taiwanese, fewer and fewer people who want to vote for a party that still claims in some ways to be like a party associated with China, or pro some form of unification with China in the future, which has been the traditional position of the KMT. From China's perspective, the Chinese government is very, very, very skeptical of and worried about the DPP. I think they are very convinced that the DPP is sort of biding its time, but ultimately will want to declare independence, and is sort of leading Taiwan closer and closer to independence. And so from the Chinese government's perspective, they have tried a variety of techniques, I think, to encourage voters not to vote for the DPP, using things like disinformation campaigns, trying to sort of buy influence in local elections. But ultimately, they haven't really been successful in stemming the tide. A lot of people are still turning out to vote for the DPP. And so I think that is something that is a potential cause for concern, that if Chinese leaders think that there is no electoral path toward a more pro-China government being elected in Taiwan, that they might see that as a reason to pursue an invasion or other kinds of military means to encourage, or force some kind of unification or annexation of Taiwan. I think another reason why we're seeing rising tensions just have to do with the fairly dramatic changes in China in recent years. So Xi Jinping became president of China in 2012 and the head of the Communist Party, which is really the primary source of his power. That's more important than his title as president. He seems quite obsessed with the idea of sort of overseeing the great rejuvenation of the Chinese people, and sort of proving that China has overcome the legacies of that century of humiliation that I talked about earlier. And so some people have speculated that a part of this for him is proving that he can force Taiwan to, he can annex Taiwan or cause Taiwan to be brought, in as part of China. People also look at what happened in Hong Kong in 2019 and 2020 when there were mass protests that ultimately were pretty brutally repressed, as evidence that this one country, two systems model, this idea that you could have an area that is part of China but has a separate constitution or separate legal code, that was the promise that was made to Hong Kong. It now is very clearly a lie. I mean, people now, and there are tons of people who are in jail in Hong Kong for their participation in these protests. The separate constitution that Hong Kong has been really just sort of run roughshod over. There are now very few protections for things like freedom of speech or association in Hong Kong. And so people look at that and they say, in China, if the Chinese government were to annex Taiwan and employ something like a one country, two systems model, which is what the Chinese government has said it would like to do in Taiwan, this is really going to just, Taiwan will lose all of the freedoms that it has. It'll lose its robust democracy, it'll lose its free press, its freedom of association, all of those things. And so I think those things have made people in Taiwan much more concerned about China. And the example of Hong Kong certainly has loomed quite large in recent elections, like in the 2020 election. That seemed to be part of what was driving people to the polls to support the DPP, the more sort of China skeptical party in Taiwan. There also are changes in China, like the very rapid military modernization that has occurred in the last decade. It began earlier than that, but there have been dramatic changes that have just made China much more capable, I think, of pursuing something like a blockade of Taiwan or an invasion. They're not there yet, but it's clear that they are sort of on a route to being prepared to engage in that kind of military activity in the future if they should choose to do so. And so obviously these are things that lead people to think that perhaps China's goal is to pursue some kind of like military strategy for taking over control of Taiwan. And then I think another set of changes that have occurred are as the U.S. China relationship has soured, there has been a sort of related turn toward more support for Taiwan among members of Congress and the executive branch. And so the visit of Nancy Pelosi, who was then Speaker of the House, to Taiwan in August 2022 was one example of just one of many US politicians who's gone to visit Taiwan since the pandemic. The Chinese government saw this as especially provocative because of her high position at the time. There have also been bills, this wasn't signed into law, but the Taiwan Policy Act made it through the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. It was like quite a strongly supportive bill, pro-Taiwan bill, that would have moved closer to sort of treating Taiwan more like a country, not formally recognizing it as a country or an ally of the US, but kind of elevating its status in ways that moved closer to that. And so, you know, some people say this is necessary in the face of Chinese aggression toward Taiwan. From the Chinese government perspective, they look at these things and talk about them as kind of salami slicing, like the US sort of gradually changing its policy toward Taiwan in a way that moves closer to formally recognizing it as an ally in ways that the Chinese government sees as really kind of unacceptable. So I think what's happened now is that the US and China are sort of locked into what political scientists sometimes talk about as a security dilemma over Taiwan, where each side really mistrusts the other's intentions. The US government looks at the Chinese government and says they're preparing to invade. The Chinese government looks at the US government and says they're preparing to sort of to enable Taiwan to declare independence or to formally recognize Taiwan as a diplomatic ally. And anything that either of those countries does, even if they themselves interpret it as a defensive move to protect Taiwan against aggression, the other side interprets it as an offensive move, right? An attempt by the US to strengthen its position from China's perspective, or an attempt by China to, you know, strengthen its ability to invade Taiwan from the US perspective. And so the danger of this is that it can lead to a kind of ramping up where each side looks at the moves that the other is making and says, oh, well, if you're going to do that, then I also need to do this other more aggressive thing. And so you can wind up in a situation of, you know, real potential for military conflict, even if everyone in theory recognizes that avoiding military entanglement would be the best move for everyone. I think another thing that's happened is that as the U.S.-China relationship writ large has become increasingly tense, and as what were once sort of normal, everyday areas of communication and engagement have declined, so around things like environmental cooperation, economic engagement, a lot of those things have disappeared in the last 5 years. And so now Taiwan just has become a much bigger part of the relationship. We're not talking about any of the stuff that used to be pretty easy to agree about. And so all that's left is the stuff that we can't agree on. And so I think that has become really challenging because there aren't this sort of easy wins, the easy things where you can say, okay, like we'll work with you on this thing and we'll sort of take the heat off of, or take the focus off of, these more intractable issues. I do think, though, that we shouldn't necessarily look at, although this situation is a kind of, is certainly like a cause for consternation, and I think there's a lot that is really concerning about this sort of high level of tension in the Taiwan Strait and between the US and China more broadly. I think it's important to recognize that that does not necessarily mean that there is going to be an invasion tomorrow. And I get very frustrated by the sort of repetition of narratives often in the media about how there is going to be an invasion in 2027. This 2027 date has sort of taken over a lot of people's mindsets. There's, I think, a really useful just sort of long-form journalism piece that talked about this, called How DC Became Obsessed with the Potential 2027 Invasion of Taiwan. And, you know, I think there's really a lot of evidence that China is eager to increase its military capability, right? To be able to stage an invasion, to be able to have a world-class maritime force and things like that. But that's not necessarily the same as an intention to invade, right? I think it's important to think about sort of capabilities and intentions separately. And Xi Jinping, I think, is facing a lot of domestic challenges within China right now. The Chinese economy is not doing well. Unemployment is very high, especially youth unemployment was as high as like almost 20% in the last year. And so I think that something that's as risky a gamble as trying to invade Taiwan, risking a military conflict with the U.S., risking the economic and political consequences for China that would almost certainly follow. It's not really clear to me that that would be a sensible gamble for the Chinese government to pursue at this point. That said, I think that there are lots of things that are sort of dependent on the choices of individual leaders. And we're obviously in a moment right now where I think U.S. foreign policy is unpredictable and in flux. It seems like Elon Musk's preferences on China are probably quite different from Marco Rubio's preferences on China, for instance. And so I think what the U.S. decides to do vis-a-vis China and Taiwan could change China's calculations, just as obviously what Chinese leaders or Taiwanese leaders choose to do could also kind of affect this triangular relationship between the three. So I don't worry about a war coming tomorrow, but I do also think it's really important to pay close attention to what this different set of leaders is kind of doing and talking about publicly, because that could potentially change. So I will stop there, and I'm very eager to hear comments and questions. Thank you.
And we are recording this, so I will be bringing the microphone around. Make sure you talk into it for the recording. I see a hand back there.
Given the fact you said that the feelings in Taiwan that people really want to be is going up, 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 how do you explain the recent decision to decrease their defense budget by big numbers?
Yeah, so Taiwan is in a interesting political moment, as many countries seem to be around the world, where one party, I'll actually go to this slide. So the DPP controls the presidency. They are the party that is traditionally more skeptical of China, and under the previous DPP president, they also had a majority in the legislature, and so they were increasing the defense budget. Currently, they do not control the legislature, and the budgetary process is controlled by the legislature. So the challenge is, I think the president would like to increase the defense budget, and the legislature is really controlled by the KMT, which thinks that the best approach to China is to avoid conflict and to sort of de-escalate by establishing warmer ties with China. And so the KMT has argued that things like increasing the defense budget actually make Taiwan less safe because they're more likely to provoke a Chinese response. And so I think some of the budget debates, like that's the root of them is a sort of party politics. The party that controls the legislature thinks very differently about China and what kind of threat it poses than the party that controls the presidency.
I notice you have the Taiwan People's Party and you haven't even mentioned them.
Yeah.
I was under the impression that most of the politics evolved around the green and the blue.
Yeah.
But could you just tell us a little
Sure.
about that, please? And where do they have their power?
Yeah, really, really interesting party. So for a long time, as you said, essentially for the entire era of democratic politics in Taiwan, the primary political fight has been between the KMT, which is the more pro-China party, and the DPP, which is the more sort of party of Taiwan sovereignty, I guess. The TPP arose fairly recently as a new party, really built around the personality of one person. So Ko Wen-je, who was their presidential candidate, was the mayor of Taipei. He was also a surgeon at like the top medical school in Taiwan. And so he sort of built this party around the idea that people in Taiwan were sick of arguing over China all the time, and really they wanted a party that was going to focus more on sort of bread and butter domestic political issues, cost of housing, social welfare, the sort of, they said like, we want, people want someone who's going to talk about the things that affect their daily lives. The party really has been primarily a venue for Ke, and so he has a set of supporters, but one of the things that's really interesting is that he actually right now is in jail for sort of corruption while he was mayor of Taipei. And so it'll be very interesting to see how the party evolves and whether the party is able to sustain support if he is no longer its figurehead, or like, will he remain its figurehead while he's in jail? Unclear. So it right now actually is powerful in the legislature because the legislature is pretty evenly divided between the KMT and the DPP. And so the TPP has the ability to be the sort of kingmaker in the legislature. So they right now are primarily caucusing with the KMT in this more pro-China position. But obviously they kind of can threaten potentially to vote with the DPP as a way to sort of maximize their own leverage. But yeah, it's been interesting in Taiwan. I think a lot of people are a little bit tired of these two main parties and have been looking for an alternative. So there was a brief period where there were some other small parties that seemed to be kind of ascendant and did pretty well in legislative races, like in one cycle or two cycles, and then they fell apart a little bit. And so I think people are sort of waiting to see whether the TPP will be a more long-lasting force in Taiwan politics or whether it also is going to kind of crumble now that it's embroiled in a number of scandals.
Sarah, thanks for the presentation. There's a lot I didn't know about Taiwan that I learned from that. Two things. One is, do you think that there is less likelihood that China would invade Taiwan compared to Putin and Ukraine, because it's an all or nothing proposition, that if Chinese invaded, they would actually then have to govern Taiwan, whereas my perception is that Putin knew from the beginning that even if Donald Trump came back and waded into the mix and stopped this conflict, that even if it ended and he didn't get all of Ukraine, he'd get something. So there was some end game for him, but perhaps for Xi, it's all or nothing with Taiwan. And my second question is, because of the problems that China is having, is it now easier and or more common for Chinese, maybe young Chinese, as you mentioned, with high unemployment, to actually emigrate to Taiwan? And are they going to Taiwan to try to work? Are they not allowed to leave? What's the situation there? So, sorry, just two questions.
No, great questions. And yeah, I think just on your first point about sort of like Taiwan's isolation from things like, international sporting events or things like that, I think the Chinese government has been very effective at using its size and economic and political influence to try to isolate Taiwan in a variety of ways. So one of the examples that I often point to is that Taiwan is not allowed to participate in the World Health Organization. And so during COVID, even though it was one of the early success stories at controlling COVID, there was no international mechanism for Taiwanese public health experts to meet in collaboration with experts from around the world to share strategies. And there's lots of examples of, like in the Olympics, Taiwanese athletes can't compete under their own flag. There was a student group, and a Taiwanese student was not allowed to enter the UN building because he had his Taiwan passport, and Taiwan is not a UN member country. So there are, sort of large ways and small in which I think China tries to enforce its narrative that Taiwan does not exist as its own place. I do think that there's been a real resurgence, especially in the last few years politically. There's so many more stories about Taiwan in like the New York Times and things like that than there were 10 years ago. And so I think we're seeing that in things like there are cookbooks about Taiwanese food, there are children's books at the local library that are by Taiwanese American authors or Taiwanese authors talking about Taiwan, television shows that are talking about elements of Taiwanese culture as different from Chinese culture. I do think that these are all ways that people are sort of trying to push back a little bit against the PRC narrative that, you know, there's nothing distinctive about Taiwan or that it's not worth kind of understanding as its own place. So in terms of Chinese students or you know, unemployed people going to Taiwan, it is essentially impossible right now to go back and forth. So for a variety of reasons, I think in Taiwan, there's a lot of skepticism, especially by the DPP. There was a period when there were quite a lot of Chinese tourists coming to Taiwan, and I think there's some concern that some of them are spies, and also like feelings about the presence of large numbers of Chinese tourists were just very mixed. I think some people felt like they were a sort of unwanted presence in Taiwan. And on the Chinese side, the Chinese government has sort of tried to punish Taiwan for electing the DPP by pulling back all of those Chinese tour groups. So Chinese tour groups can't go anymore. Individual Chinese citizens occasionally can go, but it's really difficult and complicated. And you essentially can't, as a Chinese citizen, fly like directly from China to Taiwan. So there was a period, you know, when there was a ton of movement back and forth, Chinese students going to universities in Taiwan, people from Taiwan going to work in China. You know, there still are Taiwanese business people who have things like factories in China, but on the whole, there's just much less person-to-person contact than there was 20 years ago, I would say. And then the third question was about the prospects for conflict and
Xi's strategy of the gamble of an invasion of Taiwan, like
versus
Putin's
Ukraine.
calculation to try
Yeah.
to take over Ukraine.
It's hard to know, and honestly, I mean, I think you know, if you were Xi Jinping looking at how things have gone in Ukraine, I don't think you would necessarily interpret that as like a sign that you should invade Taiwan tomorrow, right? Because I think, I mean, Putin thought he'd be done in 3 days, and it hasn't gone according to plan, right? And, you know, I think some people have made sort of the opposite argument, saying that, you know, China could always just try, and then if it doesn't succeed, it can like try again, right? There's no like end point on which it's not like it only gets one shot at an invasion. And so, you know, some people who think an invasion is somewhat likely, that's one of the arguments that they make, is that, you know, Xi Jinping could easily try to take one of the outlying islands, for instance, rather than first trying a sort of invasion of the main island. But yeah, I mean, it is hard to know. I think there are some ways in which Ukraine and Taiwan obviously have a lot of analogies, especially in terms of the way that Putin talks about Ukraine as a sort of historical part of Russia and the way that Xi Jinping talks about Taiwan as a historical part of China. But I also think they're quite different in terms of their sort of global place within the global economy is a little bit different. U.S. investment in the two places is a little bit different.
But is it
yeah.
unrealistic to think that if China wanted to do
Yeah.
that, they could just easily invade? I mean, wouldn't the difference in military power be
So-
so overwhelming it would be easy for them to take Taiwan?
So I think there are a couple, I mean, this is something that military folks argue about a lot. Geographically, invading Taiwan is very hard, right? So there are disadvantages to Taiwan from the fact that it doesn't have a border, right? It doesn't have like a border with Poland for resupplying if there were an invasion. But there are real advantages to being an island in terms of making it hard to invade. And the geography of Taiwan, I think, would make something like a maritime invasion, like a naval invasion, really difficult. You know, China's military is approaching parity with the U.S., right? And so some of the wargaming exercises, I think, a lot of the sort of how they play out depends a lot on whether Japan and Australia and other allies worked with the U.S. to defend Taiwan and in what ways they work to support Taiwan. That I think is a different situation than like a head-to-head conflict between the U.S. and China over Taiwan. but it's also, I think there are a lot of sort of unknowns, right? So like the will to resist of the Ukrainian people, something that clearly Putin really underestimated, and that's one of the big debates in Taiwan is what is the willingness of civil society to resist? What is the capability of people who aren't enlisted in the military to stand up to an invasion? And obviously that's the kind of thing that people ask survey questions about, but you don't really know in a hypothetical way. Yeah.
I think we're going to stop this here. If we could all thank Sarah for this great presentation. We have a little gifty for you from Prosperity Candle, which is a company based in East Hampton, Massachusetts, and their products are made by refugees from Burma, I think. But I hope you'll enjoy that. So again, speaking of refugees, our next program will be March 26th, where we'll hear an update on the refugee experience in the United States. Thank you again for coming. Again, if you aren't a member, if you are not on our email list, please let me know. Thank you very much.